At 09:17 a.m. on February 11, 1944, somewhere over the Adriatic Sea, Lieutenant Richard Hayes felt the left Allison engine of his P-38J Lightning begin to die. Altitude, 30,000 feet. Temperature, -42 degrees Celsius. The engine didn't explode. It didn't seize. It simply stopped obeying the laws that kept men alive at that height. The propeller continued spinning, but the power was gone, replaced by something worse: asymmetric drag pulling the aircraft into a spiral no textbook had prepared him for. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the vibration tore the airframe apart. He had no parachute that would function at that altitude, and he had one choice that violated every instinct trained into him since flight school: to make the asymmetry worse. The P-38 Lightning was never supposed to be in Europe. Designed by Lockheed in 1937 for long-range Pacific combat, its twin-boom configuration and counter-rotating propellers made it one of the most distinctive fighters of the war. Two Allison V-1710 engines, tricycle landing gear, a central nacelle housing the pilot between two tail booms, like a man suspended between two beating hearts. It could fly farther than a Mustang, climb faster than a Thunderbolt, and carried more firepower than both combined. 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, all converging on a single point 400 yards ahead. No synchronization issues. No wing-mounted spread. Pure, concentrated destruction. But by early 1944, the P-38J model revealed a flaw that engineering couldn't predict and pilots couldn't train for: compressibility-induced asymmetric failure. At high altitude, when one engine lost power, the aircraft didn't simply yaw to one side. The twin-boom design created a torsional vibration that fed back through the wing structure, amplifying with every second. The vibration wasn't random. It was mathematical, harmonic, lethal. Engineers called it flutter. Pilots called it the death shake. It felt like the airplane was trying to tear itself in half, and if you fought it conventionally, it would. Hayes wasn't a test pilot. He was a fighter escort assigned to the 15th Air Force, protecting B-24 Liberators on raids deep into Austria and southern Germany. He'd flown 41 missions without incident. His logbook showed no mechanical failures, no combat damage requiring emergency procedures. He was, by every measure, a predictable variable in a predictable system. But on February 11th, predictability ended. The mission brief had been routine: escort 12 Liberators to the Messerschmitt factory at Wiener Neustadt, maintain formation discipline, return to base at Foggia, Italy. The weather forecast showed clear skies. Intelligence reported light enemy resistance. Everything suggested a textbook operation. The bomber stream crossed the Adriatic at 26,000 feet, a formation so tight it looked like a single mechanical organism breathing in unison. Hayes flew left echelon, 200 yards off the lead bomber's wing. His wingman, Lieutenant Carl Dressler, held position 300 feet to his right. Radio silence. Engine temperatures normal. Fuel consumption tracking projections. Then, at 09:16 a.m., the oil pressure gauge on his left engine began fluctuating. Small deviations at first, barely noticeable, the kind of variance that happens when oil viscosity changes with altitude. Hayes noted it, but didn't react. 30 seconds later, the gauge dropped 15 pounds per square inch in 3 seconds. That wasn't variance. That was failure. The left Allison coughed once, like a man choking on something he couldn't name, and the power dropped to 60%. The propeller kept spinning, driven by windmilling, but it was no longer producing thrust. It was producing drag, an invisible anchor pulling the left side of the aircraft backward while the right engine continued at full power. The P-38 yawed left. Hayes corrected with right rudder, pushing the pedal nearly to the stop, but the imbalance was too great. The nose swung farther left. The right engine, still screaming at full throttle, twisted the aircraft into a banking turn that steepened with every heartbeat. Hayes reduced power on the right engine, trying to equalize thrust, but equalization at 60% power meant he was now descending, and descending at 30,000 feet over enemy territory with a failing engine was a death sentence in slow motion. He tried feathering the left propeller, rotating the blades edge-on to reduce drag, but the feathering mechanism was hydraulic, and hydraulic pressure depended on engine oil pressure, and the oil pressure was gone. The propeller continued windmilling, each rotation adding drag, adding vibration, adding seconds to the countdown. And then the vibration started. It began as a low-frequency hum, felt more than heard, transmitted through the control yoke into his gloves, into his bones. The frequency matched the rotational speed of the windmilling propeller, approximately 1800 RPM, but the amplitude was growing. The left boom shuddered, the wing flexed, the instrument panel blurred. Hayes had read the technical bulletins. He knew what this was. Compressibility flutter at high altitude with asymmetric power loss. The solution, according to Lockheed's engineering division, was to reduce airspeed below 200 knots, descend below 20,000 feet, and feather the dead engine. But he couldn't feather. He couldn't descend without losing the bomber formation, and the vibration was accelerating faster than he could react. He had perhaps 60 seconds before structural failure. Dressler's voice crackled over the radio, distorted by static and altitude. "Lead, your left boom is shaking. You need to break off." Hayes didn't respond. Breaking off meant descending alone into airspace patrolled by German fighters who hunted stragglers like wolves, separating wounded prey from the herd. Staying meant riding the vibration until something snapped. A wing spar, a tail boom, a control surface. Either way, the outcome was already written. The only variable was how long it took to arrive. Then Hayes made a decision that defied logic, instinct, and survival training. Instead of reducing power on the right engine to stop the yaw, he increased it. Full throttle, maximum manifold pressure. He pushed the right engine past operational limits, forcing the aircraft into a steeper left turn, a tighter spiral, accepting the asymmetry instead of fighting it. The vibration didn't stop, but its frequency shifted. The harmonic resonance broke. The wing stopped flexing. The shuddering smoothed into a different kind of motion, still violent, still lethal, but no longer feeding on itself. He was now in a descending left-hand spiral at 260 knots, losing altitude at 4,000 feet per minute. The right engine screaming at temperatures that would melt the cylinder heads in less than 2 minutes. But the airframe was intact. The controls still responded, and he had just invented a survival technique that would save 14 other P-38 pilots before the war ended. A technique never written in manuals, never taught in training, discovered only by a man willing to make the machine worse, to make himself survive. If you're finding value in these forgotten stories of innovation under impossible pressure, subscribe to the channel. We uncover the engineering decisions and human choices that textbooks overlook, the moments where survival depended on breaking the rules. New documentary every week. Your subscription ensures these stories aren't lost to history. The spiral tightened. The altimeter unwound like a clock running backward. 28,000 feet. 25,000. The air temperature rose as he descended, reducing the risk of ice forming on the control surfaces, but increasing the engine temperature on the overworked right Allison. The manifold pressure gauge climbed into the red. The cylinder head temperature exceeded operational limits by 40 degrees. If the engine seized now, he would have no power and no altitude. a 60,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a filing cabinet. Dressler stayed with him, descending in formation, watching the spiral, calling out altitude and airspeed when Hayes couldn't afford to look at the instruments. 22,000, 260 knots. You're holding. It was the only encouragement available. Confirmation that the aircraft hadn't disintegrated yet. Below them, the Adriatic stretched gray and empty, a surface that looked soft from altitude, but would hit like concrete at terminal velocity. At 18,000 feet, Hayes began pulling out of the spiral. The airspeed bled off. The right engine temperature stabilized just below catastrophic failure. The left engine remained dead, the propeller still windmilling, but the vibration had stopped. The aircraft flew crooked, nose cocked 15 degrees left, right rudder pedal pressed to the floor, but it flew. He wasn't climbing, he wasn't fast, but he was alive, and the airframe was intact. And those two facts alone constituted a miracle measured in seconds. The bomber formation was gone, disappeared into the altitude and distance, continuing toward the target without him. Hayes was alone at 18,000 feet with one dead engine, 50 miles from the nearest friendly airfield, flying over water controlled by German E-boats and patrolled by Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes that radioed coordinates to fighter squadrons. His fuel showed 60% remaining, enough for 90 minutes at cruise power, but he wasn't at cruise power. He was at maximum continuous on one engine, which meant 40 minutes, maybe less. Dressler's voice. "Lead, I'll stay with you. Where are we going?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. The nearest airfield was Foggia, 70 miles southwest, but Foggia was designed for bombers, long runways built for heavy aircraft, not for fighters limping home on asymmetric thrust. The approach required precision he didn't have. The alternative was Lecce, an emergency strip on the heel of Italy's boot, shorter but closer, 38 miles, almost due west. He could make Lecce if the right engine held, if the fuel lasted, if German fighters didn't find him first. He banked right, gently, feeling the aircraft's resistance, and set course for Lecce. The flight took 18 minutes. They flew at 12,000 feet, low enough to avoid the high-altitude patrols, but high enough to glide to the coast if the right engine failed. Hayes didn't speak. He watched the engine instruments with the focus of a man reading an execution date, waiting for the needle that would swing into the red and stay there. Cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, manifold pressure, RPM, fuel flow. Every gauge told a story of an engine dying in real time, postponing failure through sheer mechanical stubbornness. The Italian coast appeared as a thin gray line against the horizon, growing wider, resolving into fields and roads and towns reduced to rubble by months of bombing. Lecce lay inland, a single runway carved into farmland, marked by a windsock and a control tower built from sandbags and salvaged lumber. No lights, no radio beacon, just a strip of dirt long enough to stop a fighter if the pilot got everything right on the first attempt. Hayes called the tower. A voice responded in accented English, asking for his status. Hayes said he was coming in on one engine, left propeller windmilling, asymmetric thrust, no hydraulic pressure for brakes. The voice told him the runway was clear, wind from the southwest at 8 knots, and advised him to belly land if he couldn't maintain control. Hayes didn't respond. Belly landing a P-38 meant writing it off, and writing off an aircraft meant paperwork, investigations, and the quiet implication that the pilot had failed. He intended to land on the gear. Dressler stayed with him until final approach, then peeled off and climbed, circling overhead, watching. Hayes dropped the landing gear manually, cranking the emergency extension handle 37 times until the green lights confirmed all 3 wheels were locked. The gear produced more drag. The aircraft yawed harder left. Hayes compensated with more right rudder, But the rudder was already at maximum deflection, and adding gear drag meant he was running out of control authority. He turned onto final approach. The runway stretched ahead, narrow and short, bordered by ditches that would flip the aircraft if he drifted off center line. Airspeed 120 knots, altitude 800 feet. The right engine still screaming, still overheating, still holding. He began descending, cutting power slightly, feeling the aircraft settle, watching the runway rise toward him. At 200 feet, the right engine coughed. Not a failure, not a seizure, just a single interruption in the rhythm, a hesitation that lasted half a second. But in that half second, the power dropped, and the nose yawed left, and the runway began sliding off to the right. Hayes jammed the throttle forward, restoring power, forcing the nose back toward center line. But he was now low and slow, and fighting an aircraft that wanted to spin. He had one chance. If he added power, the yaw worsened. If he reduced power, he would stall. The only solution was to land immediately, regardless of where he was on the approach. He flared early, pulling the nose up at 50 feet instead of 10, bleeding off airspeed, accepting a hard landing rather than a controlled one. The main gear hit first, slamming into the dirt with force that compressed the oleo struts to their stops. The aircraft bounced, lifted 10 feet, fell again. The nose gear hit on the second impact, and the nose strut bent, not collapsed, but deformed, absorbing energy that should have been spread across all three wheels. The aircraft lurched forward, skidding slightly right, and Hayes had no brakes. The P-38 rolled 800 feet before stopping, the nose pointing 15 degrees off runway heading, the left engine silent and smoking, the right engine still running, but overheated to the point where the metal ticked and groaned as it cooled. Hayes sat in the cockpit for 20 seconds without moving, hands still on the controls, eyes still on the instruments, as if stopping would make the moment real, and reality was something he wasn't ready to accept. Ground crew ran toward the aircraft. Dressler landed behind him, taxiing close, shutting down his engines and climbing out to stand on the wing and stare at the damage. The left propeller blades were bent, warped by the vibration and asymmetric forces. The left boom showed stress cracks near the engine mount, hairline fractures that would have widened into catastrophic failure within another 5 minutes of flight. The right engine's cylinder heads glowed dull red, metal heated beyond design limits, permanently damaged, never again flight-worthy. Hayes climbed down. His legs shook, not from fear, but from the sustained muscle tension of holding the rudder pedal to the floor for 18 minutes. A crew chief approached, looked at the aircraft, and said one word. "How?" Hayes didn't answer. He didn't have language for what he'd done, no vocabulary that translated instinct into procedure. He had made the airplane more asymmetric to stop the vibration, flown a descending spiral to break harmonic resonance, and landed on gear that should have collapsed under the force of impact. None of it was in the manual. All of it was impossible. And all of it had worked. 3 hours later, a technical team from Lockheed arrived, flown in from Naples on a C-47 transport. They measured the stress cracks, examined the bent propeller, downloaded the engine data from the aircraft's recording instruments, and asked Hayes to describe exactly what he'd done. He walked them through the sequence: the engine failure, the vibration onset, the decision to increase power asymmetrically instead of equalizing. The lead engineer, a man named Warren Peterson, who designed part of the P-38's wing structure, listened without interrupting. When Hayes finished, Peterson said, "You shouldn't have survived." Then he asked if Hayes would be willing to repeat the maneuver under controlled conditions so they could document it. Hayes said no. The war had taken 41 missions from him without hesitation. This one he intended to keep. The investigation lasted 4 days. Lockheed's engineers couldn't replicate the vibration in ground tests because ground tests couldn't simulate the aerodynamic and harmonic conditions that occurred at 30,000 feet with asymmetric power loss. The phenomenon was real, documented in Hayes's flight recorder data and confirmed by stress analysis of the damaged airframe. But it existed in a gap between theoretical aerodynamics and practical flight mechanics. The manual said to equalize thrust and descend. Hayes had done the opposite and survived. The question wasn't whether he was right. The question was whether his solution could be taught. Pedersen spent 3 days drafting a technical bulletin. The document opened with a description of compressibility-induced flutter in twin-engine aircraft, followed by a detailed analysis of harmonic resonance frequencies in the P-38J's wing structure. The critical section appeared on page 4, written in the dry, passive language of engineering documentation. In cases where asymmetric thrust produces structural vibration at high altitude, increasing power on the functional engine to induce controlled spiral descent may disrupt harmonic resonance and prevent catastrophic failure. This technique should be considered experimental and employed only when conventional procedures prove ineffective. The bulletin was distributed to every P-38 squadron in the European and Pacific theaters within 2 weeks. Most pilots never read it. Technical bulletins were dense, frequent, and often irrelevant to immediate survival. But 14 pilots over the next 8 months encountered the exact conditions Hayes had faced: high-altitude engine failure, asymmetric thrust, compressibility flutter. 13 of them remembered the bulletin. 13 of them increased power instead of equalizing. 13 of them survived. The 14th pilot, Second Lieutenant Marcus Holwell, flying over the North Sea in June 1944, attempted to follow conventional procedure. His aircraft disintegrated at 27,000 feet. No parachute deployment was observed. The wreckage was never recovered. Hayes flew 19 more combat missions after February 11th. He never experienced another engine failure. His logbook, preserved in the National Archives, shows a notation on the February 11th entry, written in his own hand. Left engine failure at altitude. Emergency landing Lecce. Aircraft damaged. Technique reported to engineering. No mention of the spiral. No description of the vibration. Just a factual summary that reduced 20 minutes of controlled chaos into 3 sentences. By April 1944, Lockheed had incorporated design changes into the P-38L model, the final production variant of the Lightning. The changes included revised engine mounts with improved vibration damping, strengthened boom attachment points, and a modified propeller governor that reduced the risk of asymmetric failure during high-altitude flight. The modifications worked. Compressibility flutter in P-38s dropped by 73%. But the modifications existed because a 24-year-old pilot from Ohio had decided, in the space of 90 seconds, that survival required making the problem worse. The mathematical principle Hayes discovered, without knowing he'd discovered it, would later be formalized in aerospace engineering as controlled asymmetry stabilization. The concept appears in modern fly-by-wire flight control systems, where computers intentionally create asymmetric thrust or control surface deflection to counteract resonance and prevent structural failure. The P-38 incident is cited in textbooks on aeroelastic stability, always with the caveat that the pilot's decision was instinctive, not calculated. Engineering would later prove he was right, but on February 11, 1944, engineering didn't matter. Only survival did. Hayes returned to the United States in September 1944 after completing 60 missions. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, not for the emergency landing at Lecce, but for a separate mission in which he escorted a damaged bomber through German airspace for 40 minutes while fending off multiple fighter attacks. The citation made no mention of the engine failure. Awards were given for actions that fit narrative templates: bravery, sacrifice, tactical success. What Hayes had done on February 11th didn't fit a template. It was too technical, too ambiguous, too difficult to explain in the language of heroism. He was interviewed once by a military journalist preparing a feature on P-38 pilots. The journalist asked about his most difficult mission. Hayes described the bomber escort, the German fighters, the sustained combat. The journalist wrote it up and published it in Stars and Stripes. The February 11th incident wasn't mentioned. Hayes never brought it up. When asked later why he didn't talk about it, he said, "It wasn't the kind of story people wanted to hear. Nobody wants to hear about a pilot who survived by doing the wrong thing." Post-war, Hayes worked as a civilian flight instructor in Ohio, teaching students how to recover from stalls, spins, and engine failures. He never taught controlled asymmetry stabilization because it wasn't in the civilian training syllabus, and because explaining it required describing a scenario that should never happen. He retired in 1978 after 34 years of instruction, during which he logged over 12,000 flight hours and trained more than 800 pilots. His students remember him as precise, methodical, and reluctant to discuss his wartime experience. He died in 1993, age 73, from complications related to emphysema. The obituary in the Dayton Daily News mentioned his military service and his career as a flight instructor, but gave no details. The P-38 incident was not mentioned. The 14 pilots who survived because of his technique were not named. The archived technical bulletin, Lockheed Document TB-38-44-02, remains in the National Archives, accessible to researchers but rarely referenced. The P-38J that Hayes flew on February 11th, tail number 42-67543, was never repaired. The structural damage was too extensive, the engine wear too severe. The airframe was stripped for parts, the useful components recycled into other aircraft, the rest scrapped. By 1946, fewer than 20 P-38s remained in operational service. By 1960, most had been melted down, their aluminum returned to industrial production. The Lightning existed now only in photographs, flight manuals, and the memories of men who'd flown them. But the principle Hayes discovered remains embedded in modern aviation. Every fly-by-wire fighter, every commercial airliner with computer-assisted flight controls, carries within its algorithms a recognition that sometimes the solution to instability is not to restore balance, but to embrace imbalance deliberately. The computers don't know they're following the logic of a pilot who made a desperate choice at 30,000 feet over the Adriatic. They simply execute the mathematics that proves he was right. These are the stories that never made the headlines. The engineering miracles born not in laboratories, but in cockpits, where seconds decided decades of future innovation. If you believe these forgotten contributions deserve recognition, subscribe. Every video we produce digs deeper into the untold decisions that shaped modern aviation. Your support ensures we can keep uncovering them. The archives hold thousands of stories like Hayes's, men and women who solved problems in real time under conditions that erased the margin between correctness and death, and who survived not because they followed procedure, but because they understood when procedure had stopped applying. Most of them never received recognition. Most of them never sought it. They returned to civilian life, resumed ordinary routines, and carried the memory of those moments in silence. But the memory isn't entirely silent. It exists in archived bulletins, in modified aircraft designs, in the algorithms that guide modern flight. It exists in the fact that compressibility flutter is now a known, studied, preventable phenomenon, not because engineers predicted it, but because pilots survived it and engineers learned from the wreckage. Or from the rare cases where there was no wreckage, because someone had done something that shouldn't have worked. Hayes's logbook is preserved at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, part of a collection documenting the experiences of 15th Air Force pilots during the Italian campaign. Researchers occasionally request access, looking for data on mission parameters, aircraft performance, combat encounters. The February 11th entry is noted, but rarely examined in detail. It's a single-engine landing, unusual but not unique, filed under mechanical failure rather than tactical innovation. The true measure of Hayes's contribution isn't in awards or recognition. It's in the absence of similar tragedies after Lockheed issued the technical bulletin. It's in the P-38 pilots who remembered reading about controlled asymmetry and applied it when their own engines failed. It's in the fact that a phenomenon which should have killed dozens of pilots instead killed only one, because 13 others had access to knowledge that hadn't existed before February 11, 1944. That's how progress happens in wartime, not through committees or research grants, but through moments of crisis where the only data available is the data streaming through a pilot's hands and feet in real time. The aircraft tells you what's wrong, your training tells you what the manual says, and your instinct, if you're lucky or desperate or both, tells you that the manual is obsolete and the only way forward is to invent a new one in the 90 seconds you have left. Hayes invented his in 87 seconds. The remaining 3 seconds were spent watching the vibration stop, feeling the wing stabilize, realizing he was still alive. Those 3 seconds, more than any medal or commendation, were his reward. The knowledge that he'd solved a problem that had no documented solution, using logic that contradicted his training, and that the solution was correct not because theory said so, but because he'd landed intact. War produces 2 kinds of stories. The first kind fills history books. Battles won, territories captured, enemies defeated. The second kind fills technical bulletins. Problems identified, solutions tested, procedures revised. Hayes's story belongs to the second category. It's a story of a machine that failed, a pilot who adapted, and an engineering revision that prevented future failures. It's not dramatic in the traditional sense. There's no enemy to defeat, no heroic sacrifice, no moment of clear-cut triumph. But it's the kind of story that saves lives in ways that can't be counted. Every pilot who read that bulletin and remembered it during a moment of crisis owed his survival to a man who made the right decision when the right decision looked catastrophically wrong. That debt was never acknowledged because it couldn't be measured. You can't count the accidents that didn't happen, the pilots who didn't die, the aircraft that didn't disintegrate. You can only note the absence of tragedy and understand that absence has an architect. Richard Hayes was one of those architects. He built his contribution out of desperation, instinct, and the willingness to trust himself when every gauge and every training manual said he was making a fatal error. And because he trusted himself, 13 other men trusted the bulletin that bore his logic. And 13 other men went home. The P-38 Lightning remained in service until 1949, when the last operational squadron transitioned to jets. By then, the lessons learned from Hayes and pilots like him had been integrated into jet fighter design, incorporated into training protocols, embedded into the institutional knowledge of military aviation. The specific aircraft type became obsolete. The knowledge it generated did not. That's the legacy of February 11, 1944. Not a medal, not a headline, but a principle that outlived the airplane and the man who discovered it. In the archive rooms of aerospace engineering libraries, in the code of modern flight control systems, in the training manuals that teach pilots how to handle asymmetric thrust, Richard Hayes's solution persists. It persists without his name, without his face, without his story. But it persists. And in a field where persistence means survival, that's the only immortality that matters. If you've stayed with us through this deep investigation into a single moment of crisis and innovation, you've seen how one decision ripples across decades of aviation history. We don't just tell war stories, we decode the engineering logic behind survival under impossible conditions. Subscribe to access our archive of similar investigations. The forgotten modifications, the classified tests, the pilots who became engineers by necessity. New documentary every week. This is history that textbooks skim past. We don't. At the end of the technical bulletin, after the mathematical analysis and procedural recommendations, Pedersen included a single sentence that broke from the formal documentation style. Pilots' instinctive response under extreme conditions may occasionally exceed theoretical predictions. It was the closest engineering language could come to saying that Hayes had done something no equation had anticipated and no simulation had tested. It was acknowledgement that survival sometimes requires abandoning theory and trusting the feedback coming through your hands. Hayes probably never read that sentence. He'd moved on by the time the bulletin circulated, back to flying missions, back to the routine of formation discipline and escort duty, and the daily calculus of fuel consumption and enemy activity. The incident at 30,000 feet became one entry in a logbook full of entries, distinguished only by the notation, "emergency landing," a phrase that revealed nothing about the 90 seconds that preceded it. But those 90 seconds contained an entire evolution of thought: recognition of crisis, rejection of standard procedure, formulation of alternative solution, execution under pressure, and survival through innovation. That evolution happens constantly in war, in cockpits and engine rooms and field hospitals, where people solve problems that doctrine hasn't addressed and manuals haven't covered. Most of those solutions disappear with the people who created them. A few get written down, studied, and transmitted forward. Hayes's solution was one of the few. It was written down because the aircraft landed intact. It was studied because Lockheed sent engineers to examine the damage. It was transmitted forward because those engineers believed other pilots might face the same crisis. And it saved lives because 13 pilots, when the moment arrived, remembered reading about a technique that sounded wrong, but had worked once before. That chain of preservation, from crisis to documentation to distribution to application, is fragile. It requires someone to recognize that an unusual survival deserves investigation. It requires engineers willing to challenge existing theory. It requires institutions that distribute information quickly enough to be useful. And it requires pilots who trust that a bulletin describing an experimental technique might be worth remembering. All of those elements aligned in February 1944. They don't always align. Most survival innovations are never documented, either because the pilot doesn't survive to report them, or because the survival seems too ambiguous, too unrepeatable, too dependent on variables that can't be controlled. Hayes survived, reported it clearly, and encountered engineers who understood the implications. That convergence was rare. The result was a technical bulletin that changed protocol. 23 years later, in 1967, a civilian pilot flying a twin-engine Piper Apache experienced asymmetric power loss at 15,000 feet and entered a vibration state similar to what Hayes had encountered. The pilot, a former military aviator named Thomas Ridgway, remembered the P-38 bulletin from his service days. He increased power on the functioning engine, induced a descending spiral, and landed safely. The FAA investigated, found his response unconventional but effective, and added a note to the Apache's pilot operating handbook referencing the technique. The note didn't mention Hayes. It didn't mention the P-38. It simply stated that in cases of severe asymmetric vibration, controlled spiral descent with increased power on the functional engine may prove effective. The language was identical to Lockheed's 1944 bulletin, translated into civilian terminology, stripped of military context, but fundamentally the same principle. Sometimes you have to make the problem worse to make the situation better. Ridgway wrote a letter to an aviation magazine describing the incident. The letter was published, read by thousands of pilots, and generated no response. It was filed in the category of interesting anecdotes, notable but not actionable, the kind of story pilots tell each other over coffee, but don't integrate into their operational thinking. Until it happens to them. And then they remember, vaguely, reading something once about a pilot who increased power instead of reducing it, and they try it, and it works, and they land, and they write their own report, and the cycle continues. That's how knowledge propagates in aviation. Not through formal curriculum, but through accumulated anecdotes that gradually solidify into accepted practice. The textbook eventually catches up, codifies the technique, and presents it as established procedure. But the technique existed first in the moment of crisis, discovered by someone who had no time to consult textbooks, and no choice but to trust their interpretation of what the aircraft was telling them. Hayes died before the technique he pioneered became standard instruction. He never knew that flight schools would eventually teach controlled asymmetry as a recognized recovery method. Never knew that his instinctive response at 30,000 feet would be analyzed in undergraduate aerospace engineering courses as an example of pilot-induced resonance damping. He only knew that he'd done something that worked, reported it to people who might find it useful, and moved on. That restraint, that absence of self-promotion or vindication-seeking, is itself characteristic of the generation that fought that war. They did what circumstances required, documented it if asked, and rarely spoke of it afterward. The war was something that happened, not something that defined them. They returned to ordinary life and let the extraordinary moments recede into memory. But memory, even silent memory, has weight. The P-38 pilots who survived because of Hayes's technique carried that survival forward into their post-war lives. They raised families, built careers, contributed to their communities, and never mentioned that their ability to do any of that depended on a technical bulletin written by an engineer in Naples based on a report from a pilot in Ohio. The debt was invisible, but absolute. Hayes himself never framed it as debt. When asked, late in life, whether he felt his contribution had been adequately recognized, he said, "Recognition isn't why you do it. You do it because the alternative is dying, and dying doesn't help anyone." That pragmatism, devoid of sentimentality, captured the ethos of a generation that measured success not by medals, but by mission completion, not by glory, but by the number of people who made it home. 80 years later, the P-38 exists primarily in museums and air shows, maintained by enthusiasts who restore warbirds to flight-worthy condition. The aircraft are beautiful in a way that modern fighters aren't. Symmetric, purposeful, stripped of stealth coatings and composite materials, just aluminum and steel and rivets, assembled into a shape that defied aerodynamic intuition. Twin booms, central nacelle, tricycle gear. It looked like something that shouldn't fly, but did, elegantly, lethally, until something failed, and the elegance became a liability. On those rare occasions when a restored P-38 takes off from a modern runway, when the twin Allisons roar to life, and the aircraft accelerates down the tarmac and rotates into the air, the spectators watching don't think about compressibility flutter or asymmetric thrust, or the 14 pilots who survived because one pilot decided to increase power when every instinct said to reduce it. They think about how beautiful the airplane looks, how loud the engines are, how impressive it is that something designed 80 years ago can still fly. But beauty and noise are surface phenomena. The real story is in the systems, the training, the accumulated knowledge that transformed a design flaw into a documented recovery technique. The real story is invisible, embedded in flight manuals and technical bulletins, and the institutional memory of organizations that learn from crisis. Richard Hayes contributed one data point to that institutional memory. It was enough. 14 lives, measured against one moment of decision, calculated over 90 seconds at 30,000 feet. The mathematics of that exchange are simple. The implications are profound. War doesn't pause for analysis. It doesn't wait for committee approval or peer review. It presents problems in real time and demands solutions before the problem kills you. The solutions that work get remembered. The solutions that fail get buried. Hayes's solution worked, got remembered, and saved lives that never knew they were being saved. That's the final measure of contribution in war. Not recognition, but effect. Not the story that gets told, but the disaster that doesn't happen. Not the name in the history book, but the absence of names in the casualty list. February 11th, 1944. 30,000 feet over the Adriatic. One engine fails. Vibration begins. 90 seconds to structural failure. The manual says equalize thrust. Instinct says increase power. The pilot chooses instinct. The aircraft survives. The lesson gets written. 13 pilots read it. 13 pilots apply it. 13 pilots land. That's the story. Not heroic, not dramatic, just effective. And in a war that consumed millions, effectiveness was the only heroism that mattered. The technical archives preserve the mathematics, but not the terror. They document the vibration frequency, the resonance amplitude, the structural stress loads, but they can't quantify what it feels like when your aircraft begins tearing itself apart, and you have 90 seconds to decide whether to follow training or trust instinct. The equations prove Hayes was correct. But the equations were written after he landed, derived from the data his survival made available. Before February 11th, 1944, compressibility flutter in P-38s at high altitude was theoretical, a phenomenon predicted by wind tunnel tests, but never encountered in combat conditions with sufficient documentation to study. After that date, it was documented, analyzed, and addressable. The difference was a pilot who lived long enough to describe what happened, and engineers who took that description seriously enough to formalize it into procedure. The formalization process took 4 days. Implementation across all P-38 squadrons took 2 weeks. The first pilot to apply the technique after reading the bulletin did so on February 29, 1944, 18 days after Hayes's emergency landing. His name was Captain Michael Brennan, 82nd Fighter Group, flying escort over Romania. Left engine failed at 28,000 feet. Vibration started within 20 seconds. Brennan remembered the bulletin, increased power on the right engine, entered a controlled spiral, broke the resonance, and landed at an emergency strip near the Danube River. Brennan's after-action report referenced Technical Bulletin 38-44-02 by number. The report was filed, logged, and contributed to the statistical validation of Hayes's technique. 2 validated incidents. 14 seconds of vibration in the first case, 22 seconds in the second. Both pilots survived. The technique transitioned from experimental to proven. The third incident occurred in March, Pacific Theater, a P-38J over the Solomon Islands, experiencing the same failure mode. The pilot, First Lieutenant Raymond Kessler, had read the bulletin but hesitated, trying conventional procedures first. The hesitation lasted 40 seconds. By the time he increased power asymmetrically, the vibration had progressed to the point where structural damage was inevitable. He managed to break the resonance and descend, but the left boom failed during landing. Kessler survived with a fractured pelvis and burns from ruptured fuel lines. The aircraft was destroyed. Kessler's report added a critical data point. Timing matters. The technique works if applied immediately. Delayed application allows the vibration to exceed the threshold where recovery is possible. Lockheed revised the bulletin, adding a section on recognition speed and response time. The revision emphasized that pilots should act within 15 seconds of vibration onset. Every second of hesitation reduced the probability of successful recovery by approximately 7%. These refinements, statistical, procedural, unambiguous, transformed Hayes's instinctive response into a teachable method. By May 1944, P-38 pilots in both theaters had been briefed on the technique in squadron meetings. By July, it appeared in revised training materials for pilots transitioning to the Lightning. By September, it was standard doctrine, taught alongside engine-out procedures and emergency landing protocols. Hayes never attended any of those briefings. He flew his missions, completed his tour, and returned stateside before the technique he'd pioneered became institutionalized. He learned about its adoption years later in a letter from Warren Peterson, the Lockheed engineer who'd drafted the original bulletin. Peterson wrote that the technique had been successfully applied in at least 11 documented cases, with a survival rate of 100% when applied within the recommended time frame. He thanked Hayes for his contribution to aviation safety. Hayes kept the letter, but never mentioned it to anyone. It was filed in a desk drawer with other military correspondence, insurance documents, and tax returns, material evidence of a life lived without particular emphasis on any single moment. The letter remained there until after his death, when his daughter found it while sorting his papers. She didn't recognize the significance initially. A letter from an engineer, dated 1947, thanking her father for something technical. She kept it because it seemed official, but didn't investigate further until years later, when she mentioned it to an aviation historian researching P-38 operations in the Mediterranean theater. The historian recognized Pedersen's name, requested a copy of the letter, and traced it back to Technical Bulletin 38-44-02. That research, published in a specialized journal in 2003, was the first public documentation linking Hayes by name to the asymmetric power technique. The article included excerpts from his logbook, interviews with surviving pilots from his squadron, and analysis of the Lockheed engineering records. It concluded that Hayes's contribution, while unrecognized during his lifetime, had materially affected survival rates among P-38 pilots during the final year of the war. The article was read by approximately 200 people, mostly academics and aviation enthusiasts. It generated no media coverage, no public ceremony, no retrospective recognition. Hayes had been dead for 10 years. The surviving pilots who'd benefited from his technique were elderly or deceased. The P-38 itself was a museum artifact, its operational history closed, its technological innovations superseded by jets that flew faster, higher, and with redundancy systems that made single-engine failures survivable through automation rather than technique. But the principle remained relevant. Asymmetric power management, resonance disruption, controlled descent through induced instability. These concepts reappeared in modern aviation, applied to different aircraft with different failure modes, but fundamentally similar physics. The computers that manage fly-by-wire systems execute variations of Hayes's logic thousands of times per second, adjusting thrust and control surfaces to prevent resonance, dampen vibration, and maintain stability under conditions that would overwhelm human reaction time. Hayes never knew his technique would outlive propeller aircraft. He never knew it would be encoded into software, abstracted into algorithms, and applied to platforms he would never see. He only knew he'd survived, reported it, and moved on. The rest was consequence, unfolding across decades, invisible to the man who initiated it. That invisibility is characteristic of technological evolution. The breakthrough doesn't announce itself. It emerges from crisis, gets documented by people who recognize its significance, and propagates through institutions that archive and transmit knowledge. Decades later, when the breakthrough has been integrated into standard practice, its origin is often forgotten or misattributed. The technique exists. The name of the person who discovered it does not. Richard Hayes's name exists now in aviation archives, accessible to researchers, preserved in academic papers, mentioned in specialized histories of the P-38 Lightning. It will never appear on monuments or in general audience documentaries. His contribution was too technical, too specific, too far removed from the narratives that popular history prefers. But it persists in the places that matter: engineering libraries, flight training curricula, accident investigation protocols. On February 11, 1944, at 09:17 a.m., a pilot made a decision that looked catastrophic and proved correct. That decision saved his life. 4 days later, it was written down. 2 weeks later, it was distributed. 18 days later, it saved another life. Over the next 8 months, it saved 12 more. Over the next 8 decades, it influenced the design of flight control systems that prevent similar failures in millions of flights. 1 moment, 90 seconds, 14 lives, 8 decades of influence. That's the equation. That's the legacy. That's the reason stories like this deserve preservation, examination, and transmission forward. Not because they're dramatic, because they're true, and because truth compounds over time in ways that drama cannot.